Let's talk about the Moors. And the Moors are a pretty touchy subject because we have centuries of racism superimposed on top of history, and it has invoked perhaps justified opposition to the status quo. However, the Moors offer us a dynamic conflict that very few wish to tackle without unilateral assertions, which exceptions can easily be made for. And perhaps so much of this conflict has less to do with their civility and more to do, ironically, with the race of the Moors. And this is not a one-sided conflict. Both people of color and Caucasians claim the civilization of the Moors as their own. And it is not without evidence there are white Moors. Even to this day, there are white Moors. And the Bedain Moors are certainly not new, at least historically. But the fact remains there were black Moors, many of them. And this cannot be denied either. And with their icons ranging across 3 continents in 3 centuries, it would be absurd to deny that there were black Moors. Yet the white Moors do exist. So the conflict remains one of antiquity. And the answers can be found through the deductions of our anthropological investigation. As slavery was highly common in the Moorish Empire, particularly for the taking and selling of wives. The exact number of conquered peoples will never be known, but it is conservatively estimated that more than 1.2 million women were seized and made brides. And while it is certainly plausible that many of these relationships may have been consensual and voluntary, in Sheila Jeffreys' The Industrial Vagina, the Political Economy of the Global Sex Trade, the historical precedent, the contemporary example of the burgeoning and immensely profitable global sex sector of human trafficking, as well as the regional cultural practice of bride kidnapping on wedding nights, provide compelling arguments of a conflict resulting in a conquered people. However, the conquered origin is not entirely certain, and I wanted to present an alternative hypothesis that I got after watching Stephen Ranella. And Stephen Ranella is a hunter, explorer, and frontiersman, and also a very intelligent man. He recently spoke about the misconceptions about the hermited mountain men. In fact, many explorers were not xenophobic. An explorer would have been the most well-traveled, least xenophobic sort of person on the planet, and able to make better conversation with someone they can't speak the same language with. And in fact, by 1812, natives had actually visited the king in France and returned several times, and French and Indian relations were beyond cordial. And an example that holds personal significance to me is Paul Sweet. And Paul Sweet was a whaler who had arrived in Santa Cruz, California at the turn of the 19th century, and was known as an eccentric wild man who married a teenage Indian girl. And from all accounts, from what I can tell, it was consensual. However, regardless of how they came together, history is to imply that the resulting civilization would be known as the Inquisitive civilization, with citizens of all races, colors, and creeds. Or perhaps they already were. You see, this gets into the root of the name of the Moors. Because the Moors are not a people, but actually part of a place. And this might seem kind of weird, but hear me out. The Moors get their name from Mauritania, which is on the West African coast below Morocco in the Atlas Mountains, across from modern-day Algeria, formerly Carthage. And Mauritania is a fascinating place. But you see, the thing about Mauritania is it's coastal. It's not like Nigeria. In fact, it's on the other side of Africa from the oldest evidence we have of African civilizations. It's also in a region below mountains that at one point, not too long ago, would have placed Mauritania in between the islands of the Greater Lost African Sea. And it is at least anecdotally interesting that this would be the case with Mauritania, because as we've discussed in earlier videos about Madame Blavatsky's theory of the origin of man, before the civilization of Atlantis, there was a civilization called Lemuria. The Muria. Do you see where I'm going with this? And Lemuria was in the lost island of Mu. So if anyone's too annoyed that I sidestepped exactly who are the Moors originally, please take my hints and know that I will be getting back to this and the alternative origin story, or the into Africa theory. But we still need to go back further, so to be concluded. But getting back to this concept of a biracial Moorish empire, even if it existed only for a second, this is an interesting idea because it conflicts so heavily with the narrative we are told about race relations throughout history, and certainly conflicts with the narrative within our own civilization, which is essentially a long list of forced separation and inequality, of European invasions, such as the devastation in South America and the Congo, let alone across the British Empire, where a dictatorship literally owned the lives of billions of people. In fact, I think they still do. And a series of unfathomable yet unquestionable atrocities in the Dutch Congo during the rubber boom, where unbridled speculation led to the hacking off and trading of hands to pay the difference in their missing debts. And this global campaign of manifest destiny carried out across the earth genocide, war, starvation, and dehumanizing campaigns, which led to the segregation and isolation of entire peoples from each other out of an hysteria of fear, and that this all resulted from the 14 to the 1600s enslavement of these people of color and the human trafficking of these peoples across the world. But in the back of our mind, we already know that slavery comes from the word Slavic, and in fact serf comes from serving and Serbian, and that before the word slave was used, it was common to refer to a servant as a Briton. So this history of the peculiar institution and involuntary servitude becomes altogether more confusing and therefore more important to investigate. Because if history is to imply that there was a period of harmony in the Moorish Empire, which Spain only defeated in 1492, then how did we get from here to here? And I want to bring up a very important quote from the great El-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, Malcolm X, and this is from his trip to Mecca, which he returned from with a new attitude towards the human experience. And he said, "I have prayed with fellow Muslims whose eyes were the bluest of blue, whose hair was the blondest of blonde, and whose skin was the whitest of white." And he came to believe that there was something underlying the human spirit that which could unite the races. And in fact, I kind of want to just dedicate this whole video to Malcolm Shabazz, his son, and El-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, two lost great souls, undersold in history for the sake of imposters, not nearly as good, which will never compensate. So let's get things rolling, because forget what you heard, because we was friends. So I wanted to say thanks to everybody who donated so I could get a copy of the Moorish Treatise. This book is fascinating, and I've got a lot more to go into, but some of the stuff that I've found out so far I wanted to bring up, and here's some interesting stuff. So at the height of the Andalus, the Moorish Caliphate of Cordoba controlled everything below the small diverse kingdoms of the North Hispania, which had been conquered by the Habsburg families. And at this point I need to bring up a theory of mine I call spy versus spy theory. And what this theory amounts to is that in vertically stacked relationships such as employment or formalities of court, there is less vertical transparency in a relationship. And not only despite their differences, but because of their shared concern for them, the actors which interact on a level playing field, which interact in horizontal relationship archetypes, it is more typical for one to know their adversary than to understand their leaders or their servants, often resulting with separations within a corporation or culture, and a galvanization of unions and alliances, unions of the subservient, and alliances within the status quo. An example of this is the Song of Roland, which is a book from the Middle Ages that was made into a short film by Werner Herzog, rare but certainly worth seeing. It depicts the alliance between the nobility of the Visigoths and the Moorish Arabs, who found themselves all too more familiar with each other than with their servants, whom either pagan, Muslim, or Christian found themselves all working a common ground. Also soon we'll go over the Umayyad Caliphate, which extended across Semitic Arabia into East Asia, with the jewel cities of Mecca, Damascus, and Cordoba. It is perhaps more than coincidental that the Visigothic reign of Spain between the 5th and 8th centuries, and the Habsburg Empire the 15th and 18th centuries, are sandwiched between the Arab Caliphate of Arabic rule and from a time of inquisitions into the secular age. And there actually is a very interesting theory that these happened at the same time, via the phantom time hypothesis. There's actually several, and we'll do an entire episode on this theory, but a lot of it has to do with the difference between the Muslim and the Christian age, which were happening simultaneously, all during a time when many different calendars were being used in different places. each with slightly different variances in different cities under different monasteries' rules. However, for the most part, it is accepted, without question, that at the end of the 15th century began an exodus out of Spain through the road of St. James, and the reuniting and the Inquisition and just so many things seemed to culminate in the year 1492. And it was at this moment in 1492 that the Habsburg Empire both conquered Spain and began its conquest of the rest of the world, but also began another surprise, the Spanish Inquisitions. And this was during a great cultural revolution, and speculation led to all-out terror in the Spanish courts. And this was kind of a shock. You see, nobody really expected the Spanish Inquisitions, because at the time the Moorish Empire had catapulted the world into the bright ages of technology and science and astronomy, as well as a great mystical renaissance and the alchemical pursuits. And there were many that were out of line with the Spanish courts and feared for their lives because of the Inquisition. Because worse than the McCarthy trials or the guillotines of the French Revolution, the Spanish Inquisition was a literal witch hunt. Nobody was safe. People like Mother Teresa d'Avila, medieval nun and mystic, adamant lover of God and writer of the sacred cathedrals of the mind, but also the granddaughter of a rabbi, Mother Teresa d'Avila watched her grandfather and father tortured in front of her as both were forced to confess and convert to Catholicism, and she at 6 years old as well also complied. She once told God, "If you treat your friends like this, I can see why you have enemies." She remained a forever loving and faithful servant to God, however, and luckily was not burned at the stake, because the only qualification was to be non-Christian. And that was a rather broad term. That certainly included the Moors, as well as the Hebrews. In fact, it included anybody who wasn't part of the same church. This is in contrast to the Moorish Empire. All you had to do was believe in a different god, or the same god differently. You see, the main victims of the Spanish Inquisition were members of the Abrahamic traditions. This certainly included the Moors and Hebrews, but was certainly by no means exclusive. Anyone who was at odds with the church as it was seen at the time, including Gnostics, Hermetics, Coptics, or just looking different, was punishable by death. And I wanted to show this picture. When I was in Aarhus in Denmark, I saw a guy get carried off by his friends and stripped and tied to a phone pole, duct taped and covered in cinnamon, chocolate, and other spices. And when I asked what the heck, when I asked what was going on, as you might, they explained to me this is a very old Danish tradition, where bachelors are tied to trees, provoking them to get married. And the longer you take to get married, the worse it gets. At first, they just tie you to a tree in the night. Eventually, they start throwing spices until you get to 30, and then they will light you on fire. So I thought that was an interesting carryover historically. And a book worth reading if you're interested in Moorish Spain is Christianity and Islam in Spain from 756 to 1031, while Islam was still fresh in the Arab world. And early Islam is pretty fascinating. In fact, early Islam has a lot of similarities to Mormonism. And while there certainly are significant differences, the similarities are far too varied and interesting not to acknowledge. From their rejection of original sin, the prohibition of alcohol, and polygamy, the early churches of Islam and Mormonism, the religions of the prophets, are perhaps closer related than you might first think. And it's also important to remember that at the same time in Europe, Christianity was not the beige-suited Bible thumpers and Sunday school picnics that it is today. Christianity in early Europe was very eclectic, with monasteries full of monks studying demonology and chronicling their activities in giant books such as the Codex Gigas, or Devil's Bible, of the Czech priests in Prague. And many of these churches in the north, not only the southern Andalusian mosques that have been converted into cathedrals, contain inconsistent architecture, inconsistent with the place and time, as well as the out-of-place iconography of satanic and perhaps pagan at best symbolism, such as the horned Moses, which can be found across Europe. Officially, the reason given for this is a mistranslation of the word for halo from ancient Hebrew, which had been erroneously translated as horns instead of a halo. However, I found myself skeptical of this story all my life. So because these traditions were now prohibited and punishable by death, millions of people were forced to renounce their faith and do their best to hide it, and at least superficially give the appearance of submitting and accepting the socially acceptable religion of the state. And perhaps the result of this is, for many of us, it is ingrained that this choice is absurd, and perhaps inconceivable what sort of person would choose death over retracting belief. However, it is important to try to put oneself in the shoes of these people, who were being asked to curse something they believed to be true. often about family members who had died or people that their family members believed had died for them, for their community and their legacy to continue. And often they were asked to spit or stand on these icons of their heroes in order to portray and to blaspheme their legacy. And for many, the thought of betraying that history was in and of itself a sort of eternal damnation, that death seemed an easier price to pay. And an example is the Old Believers of Russia. And they're a very mystical, natural, shamanistic, Occidental priesthood. And their tradition goes back to the time of Peter the Great, but they really wanted to keep practicing their religion as they had before the 1600s. However, in the 18th century, when they were told in order to harmonize the Russian Orthodox with the Greek Orthodox Church, they would have to begin crossing themselves from the other side. The horror and shock that spread the church led to rampant suicides, as many were led to believe that they had been crossing themselves backwards satanically, and so had their families, for generations. However, many old believers continue to practice the old ways to this day, and this is particularly interesting about them because they survived not only schisms within their church or other religions, but nearly a century of communism, atheism, and iconoclasm, and still maintain an authentic legacy. So the old believers prove it is possible, either by hiding or fleeing, or remaining adamant to maintain your tradition. But because of this unexpected series of inquisitions, there was a great fleeing and a mass exodus began out of Europe through the road of St. James under the stars across the Camino de Compostela. And just so many things seem to culminate in the year 1492, from the mass exodus of the Inquisition to the reconquering of Andalusia, and even the introduction of one of history's most misunderstood explorers. And though you may know him by another name, his name was Colon, and though he was not from Spain, actually he was from Italy, he had had trouble in his own country securing financial assistance and investments, and at first before Spain he went to Portugal, which due to Moorish occupation had been introduced to the African and East Asian colonies of the Moorish Empire, and had established a major trading network. However, with more to lose than to gain, the Kingdom of Portugal twice denied Colon, and so he pivoted his efforts elsewhere. And with the help from Ferdinand and Isabella, Columbus set sail in 1492. And Christopher Colon is rebranded as Columbus. Perhaps as good a name as any, a masculine form of the goddess Columbia, the Lady of Liberty, and the emblem of the United States. And though Torquemada, the sort of McCarthy of the Inquisition, certainly did not trust this, if you'll forgive the expression, globalist, however, in his interest to create a Spain safe for himself and perhaps no one else, perhaps Torquemada saw this as a great opportunity to expel simply one more dissident, and did not so much care where Columbus went, or any of them went, so long as they left, as short-sighted as this might have been. And in fact, unwittingly, Torquemada had given his own political dissidents the infrastructure necessary to both flee and establish colonies, both out of sight and out of mind of the empire, until a time when they were strong and Spain was weak, and they could return and conquer again. And the stories of the New World are numerous, often revolving around El Dorado, gold cities, fantastic, futuristic, mechanical, self-automated, but of course always hidden in the rainforest, deep, hard to find. And if you want to get a feel for what it's like to be that deep in the Amazon, a good movie to watch is Aguirre, The Wrath of God, a Herzog film about Habsburg Spanish conquistadors, entirely filmed in German, shot in Paraguay, in a sort of medieval metaphor for Lord of the Flies. Conquered natives at the ends of conquistador swords are forced to carry the metallic spoils of their lords in chains as they venture deeper and deeper into the unknown to claim their new kingdom in the swamplands of the Amazon under fire of arrow. But the extent of exploration during the period of the 16th century cannot be underestimated, and the interaction and discourse between explorers reached new height in this time. In fact, the Prospective Exploratories Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal established the agenda for the next century of colonialism by splitting the right of conquest of the world between Spain and Portugal. And while Portugal would maintain a monopoly in Africa and Eurasia, the actual split is far fairer, at least to the conquerors, than might be thought at first glance. It is a fairly proportional division of the Earth's surfaces, both in terms of land mass, but more importantly perhaps also in terms of navigatable oceans, which facilitate their networks of trade, notably Spain, and their acquisition of Indonesia and the Javas, and the thousands of countless islands, literally beyond count and never fully mapped. Simultaneously to this acquisition of new territories, The global human trafficking markets reach an all-time high, and the Algerian and Andalus slave traders, many of them but not all former Spaniards and Portuguese, escapees from the Inquisition, and members of the mass exodus, known for their vicious exploits of the Barbary coast of Africa and their arguably indiscriminatory practices of capturing Christians, Moors, and pagans alike. Eventually, with the advent of slavers' insurance, the mass exodus of labor and resources as well as manpower catalyzed a breakaway civilization in the New Worlds, eventually culminating in the collapse of the European conquesting powers and the rise of the New World superpowers such as Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and the United States. States defined by resources and their economies, and as Weber said, by their legitimacy for their authoritarian source of violence to enforce payment of debt. This new concept of static states as opposed to nations of peoples which are migratory and come and go, eventually culminating in the Rhodesian philosophy of Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, who himself was an employee and associate of the De Beers family and an aide of the Rothschilds, and founder of the state of African Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe, is perhaps best known for his monopolization and entrepreneurship in the diamond industry, subsequently resulting in the Diamond Wars and the Blood Diamond trade, an eventual collapse of Africa in the 20th century, under pressure of the UN and the International Criminal Court, into indebted states of the World Bank. One of the first intellectuals to catch on to this was Carroll Quigley, although seemingly non-opposed. Quigley lucidly describes the agenda for control through the mechanisms of the free market, even going so far as to describe the economy as a feudalist mechanism, as a sort of feudalist machine, which governed while allowing the feeling of freedom maintained by the capacity of oneself within the economy. And so by the inevitable divine providence of economics, the rise of the colonies was met by the fall of Portugal and Spain. These Rhodesian world states are designed to be ineffectual, and one of the things Cecil Rhodes liked to do is to find a place with a balance. Take that tribe and split them in half. Draw a border down the middle of their village. Give half of the village to the warring tribe on the west, and give the other half of the village to the warring tribe on the east. He also did this with people from the north and the south. And this happened all over Africa. The notorious example, of course, is Rwanda, where the Tutsi were genocided by the Hutu. But there are many more atrocities like this, often even with their own biopic, even many more without. But the resulting world states were emptied of their indigenous civilization, and the infrastructure and regulations for corporations were heavily incentivized. And the result was the inevitable emptying of resources from these new colonies as well, which in order to maintain their sovereignty would be forced to take out extreme debt against their citizens, which they would be forced to extort from their taxpayers for generations in order to recompense this new system of triangular trade. And if you're in the Patreon, you can check the Tartary library for the Rothschilds musical, which was a fantastic Broadway musical. And this is a mainstream Broadway musical made by the Fiddler on the Roof duo. Definitely worth seeing, or hearing, because there's no recording of it that I know of. But it's a fantastic musical, and it's about a very interesting family that are pretty well known of, but are not so well known about. And it's got a ton of great songs about the history of the family, but it's really about a father and his 5 sons, and their conspiracy to overthrow the families of Europe, culminating in their harrowing defeat of the bankers in 1812, due to the brothers' rapport of correspondence, and their early knowledge of the loss of Napoleon, and their ever so extreme poker face. It is entertaining indeed. And there's a great song about the red shield over the father's door of his coin trading shop, the origin of the family's namesake. However, as lending was considered a sin, aside from the Knights Templar, the circumstance of the Rothschilds' non-Christian background has been the fuel for conspiracy for centuries. You see, due to the conception that lending was considered a sin by the Bible, only non-Christians were allowed to lend to form banks. Congruous to this and the Crusades, the fashion of trusts, or leaving property in the hands of others, became fashionable. This led to the concept of the Knights Templar Trust and the birth of the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank is one of the largest and most valuable collections of wealth in the world, both in terms of capital and promissory notes, as well as hard currency of gold and noble metals, and even priceless items of antiquity, held in a great vault. Otherwise known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, the Vatican Bank, which has never been privately audited, certainly cannot be underestimated for its impact on the world's economy over the last perhaps millennia. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but because it does keep coming up, I do want to address the secret relationship between the serfs and the bankers. And there's this book from the Nation of Islam that I'm not actually recommending you read necessarily, not just because it's universally criticized as propaganda and hate speech for its anti-Semitism, but also for its one-sidedness and its extreme lack of content regarding the Andalusians' involvement with the Moorish slave trade. And anecdotally, it is an interesting word, Semitic, because it does mean coming from the regions of essentially North Africa. And it's quite possible those of the Algerian Talmud do not come from Africa, but quite possibly come from the Tartarian region of modern-day Crimea, interestingly, recently discovered to have an older civilization with an older writing system than the Sumerian cuneiform, as well as the first discovery of the Denisovan hominid. And looking at the E1b1 haplogroup of the Ashkenazim, even DNA research seems to corroborate this claim. And while it is true that there are often many different haploids that make up the genetic mixture of a modern-day human with Ashkenazi descent, it is perhaps also not circumstantial evidence that there is generally less than 0.5% of African haploids to be found within the general population of the Ashkenazi genetic makeup. Having said that, there is a group of black Jews. Having said that, there is a very interesting group called the Beta Israelites, and they come from Ethiopia, and they keep a kosher table. And they often fight for Israel. I have seen them all over the world. Often after military conscription, Israelis spend much time abroad, and I would find them together with other Israeli soldiers, only standing across the room from each other, because the white Israelis would have very little to do with the Beta Israelites, something I found consistent enough to mention, and founded in Israel's discriminatory practices of refusing birthright to the African Beta Israelites, as well their actual expulsion from Israel, or even worse fates, such as enslavement, and in some cases sterilization. And it is perhaps ironic that meanwhile Israel has become a secular state with more religious Baha'i in parliament and atheists than anything else, and a contemporary colloquialism that effectively translates to parasitic bloodsuckers, while the Beta Israelites of Ethiopia are legendary for maintaining a legacy authentically for thousands of years, one with a shared ancestral mythology to all those inquired, hinging, however, not on where they're from, but where they stand in regards to a law in direct confrontation with disorder, a line which defines what is and is not to be and not to be. And now we get into encrypted legacy and crypto faith. And one of the ways a belief system is protected is through the tool of storytelling. And even without the ability to read or write, the passing down of information through songs and tales can last thousands of years. And there's actually a science to how stories affect the brain, and use the reward system of chemical and neuron coupling in order to store essential information, which is received through the story and saved in references associated with the feelings about the memories of experiencing that story, which then become interlocked and embedded in the psyche of the individual, therefore their children and their nation. And while stories are exaggerated and altered, this is expected and allows for the cold storage of a story's meaning over various interpretations, so that it even becomes ingrained in the storyteller to protect the essential pathos of that story despite their alterations, and in fact framing their alterations around that agenda to both maintain that story's legacy as well as excite the next generation about the information to provoke proliferation. And it was by that providence that an entire society worked and toiled and fought in order to protect these priests so that they could sing its very words. The caste system of India was designed in order to facilitate the Brahmin priests singing the mantras in order to save and preserve the language, Sanskrit, the language of the gods, as it is referred. It is important to remember for thousands of years, the language was never written. Sanskrit was only sung. Even in this telephone game, Sanskrit was very successful at maintaining itself for millennia, because the written script for Sanskrit was not completed. The technologies revolving around sound, harmonics, and music greatly progressed. Musical instruments such as the sitar made it possible to pinpoint the exact vibrational frequency, pitch, and tone, calibrated with precise tools to an extent of mathematical and religious devotion, and in fact was more the victim of mutation by conquest and intermingling rather than examples of degeneration. But the important thing is, within encryption, many things can change, and they will, and in fact they must. However, the deeper meaning is there, always waiting to be found. The support of the Patreon has really made a difference, and provided a model to produce free speech without censorship. I want to thank you guys again for your support, and mention I'm pretty excited about the file dump that's about to go down. Because the Chronicler tier was more popular than I expected, I came up with a new incentive and special offer for the highest echelon members to print 3D models of the cathedrals. So this has become a new goal once we reach 30 members. And once again, I want to say thank you, because this would not be possible without your support.